exercise 5 is related to body cavities, and we've switched to a different model now. I think this will be easier to see on this model rather than the skeleton. There's also a segment in your textbook, and I think maybe using the textbook would actually make this clear. It's page 82 of your textbook, so I encourage you to grab your textbook, and then you can work through the diagram with me from exercise 5 of the lab manual. So they discuss the body cavities, and these are internal, sort of hollow regions that might be lined with membranes, they might contain organs, and again, they're landmarks to the body. So we think first of that dorsal and ventral that we talked about earlier, the dorsal being the back side and the ventral being the belly side, and we think about some of the sort of sub-regions within those major foci, the dorsal and ventral cavities. So let's just work through the numbers that are listed in your manual together. Number 1 is the cranial cavity, which would be everything contained within the cranial bones. Again, you don't have the skeleton here for reference, but the cranium is most easily recognized as being the region that houses the brain, so the cranial region. Along with that, and this is not in order now, so I'll just kind of take a moment to find this. It will be number 7 on your diagram in the lab manual, the spinal cavity, and the spinal cavity would house the spinal cord. So the cranial and spinal cavities are both considered to be part of the dorsal cavity. The dorsal cavity is just delimited by number 8 on your picture. Again, kind of hard because of the way that this is laid out. The plane that you're seeing here isn't allowing us to see the vertebral or spinal cavity, but again, this houses the spinal cord. All right, number 2 is the thoracic cavity, and the diaphragm is this thin sheet of muscle that would really delineate the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity we know as housing our heart and lungs, and later we'll learn about the mechanism of breathing, how that diaphragm contracts and expands, or contracts and relaxes to allow expansion of the ribs and the lungs, and we'll get into more detail there. So thoracic. The thoracic cavity would be part of what we think of as the belly side or the ventral cavity, which is everything on the anterior side. Below the diaphragm, we think of the abdominal cavity. Now, your paper mentions the abdominal cavity. They just sort of indicate everything below the diaphragm, and they have a kind of dotted line on your picture to delineate the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity is really marked by the hip bones, and again, in males and females, we would have slight differences in the pelvic cavity's size and arrangement of those hip bones, but sometimes together they're called the abdominopelvic cavity. So abdominal, housing a lot of those digestive system organs, holding the kidneys, which we'll talk about later, the liver, and the spleen, and some other structures that we'll talk about later on. Abdominal, abdominopelvic, and pelvic cavity. Abdominal, pelvic, and together, abdominopelvic. We had already mentioned the spinal cavity, which houses the spinal cord. That's number 7 on your sheet. And then number 8 is the dorsal cavity, which we said is the cranium and spinal cavity together. So they walk you through that. You can use your skeleton to try to find those structures. And then if we just take a closer look for a moment at the abdominal region, and flip your page if you've got your lab manual. Again, this is also in your textbook, but this probably has more detail in the lab manual. The abdominal cavity we can consider to be subdivided in 2 ways. We can talk about subdividing it into 4 regions. So imagine that you draw a horizontal or transverse plane and a vertical or sagittal plane. We can think of things that are in the upper or lower portion of the abdominal cavity. The upper right, when we think about the upper right region, again, think of your anatomical position. So if you need to stand there with your palms forward, you can do that. The upper right region would be most recognized by housing the liver. The upper left region, you'll notice there's not quite as much going on, and we'll talk about that when we get to the abdominal cavity with the digestive system later on. And then we talk about the lower, so the lower right and lower left regions. That's one way to subdivide the abdomen. The other way is to subdivide it. Imagine that you do that, but in more detail. So subdivide it into 9 regions. So we can talk about these as regions 1 through 9, literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And you'll notice on your diagram that they each have their own label. So number 1 would be the right hypochondriac region. Number 2 would be the epigastric region. Number 3 would be the left hypochondriac region. Number 4, which if we imagine this in thirds, number 4 would be the right lumbar region. Number 5, easy, the umbilical region. Number 6, the left lumbar region. And then moving down into our lower thirds, 7, 8, and 9. 7 is the right iliac, and I always think of putting my hand on my hip to think of the iliac region. The ilium is a landmark on your coxal bone, the hip bone. So again, number 7 is the right iliac, or sometimes called right inguinal region. Number 8 is the hypogastric or pubic region. And number 9 is the left iliac or left inguinal region. And so again, we can subdivide it to 4 or 9 regions of the abdomen.